Remember, during this panel, you can ask us questions, and we'll make sure to save some time at the end to answer them. We're using Slido, Slido, you know, the thing. We're using it, and so you can type in your questions, and I'll read them at the end. First of all, thank you guys so much for being on this panel. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about what it is that you do in the company you're with.
My name's Cliff Sharples, and I'm co-CEO of a company called Fexy. We talk about ourselves as a content-driven technology company. So we own some big food sites like Serious Eats and Simply Recipes, and really are focused on how we help the home cook answer the question, what's for dinner tonight?
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Yuni Sameshima. I'm the CEO of Chicory. So here at Chicory, we do two basic things. One, we create shoppable recipes for companies. So we essentially partner with existing recipe sites, partner with online retailers, and make their content shoppable. We also help brands reach consumers through recipes.
Hey everyone, I'm Jason Cohen, founder and CEO of Analytical Flavor Systems. We have an artificial intelligence platform that models human sensory perception to predict consumer preference.
Okay, so let's start with the hard question. Is the recipe dead? Why or why not?
Yeah, I can start off. So yeah, we got asked this question a lot, I think, maybe after this event last year. Absolutely not. The recipe is not dead. I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of interest in recipes, actually. I think where we are seeing this from is when you look at meal kits. Meal kits for about 4 or 5 years just took off. Venture funding, IPOs, all that stuff. And I think that really, really helped to enforce the notion of the meal. People are still cooking at home. People want to cook at home. And yes, some of those companies may have had logistical issues, but with the advent of Amazon acquiring Whole Foods, online grocery becoming a bigger deal, and more convenience coming to this space, recipes are going to become more and more important. And I think media companies like Fexy, I think manufacturers, food companies, and retailers all see the value of recipes.
Yeah, and I think, from our perspective, raise your hands if you actually cook. Who cooks? Are recipes dead? Okay. Because you can't cook without a recipe. I mean, ultimately, I think that's, we come from a place where we actually we're creating recipes as content, and I think that, we're seeing more and more demand. Serious Eats Index is the #1 site for millennials. Millennials, there's a couple things people say, millennials don't read. They do. Serious Eats writes 3,000-word essays on why this particular recipe is exactly the right way to do it. Here's the techniques. They go into depth, and people love it. And they're cooking. So we really feel like recipes are still important. The other kind of interesting stat, which I just learned about recently, is cookbook sales are up over 20% year over year for the last couple of years. So not only like in the electronic world, I agree with everything you said in terms of they're absolutely at the center of a lot of what we're talking about today and tomorrow, but just in general, because there's such an interest in food, and 50% of millennials say they're foodies, the recipe is, they really do still cook, and you have to have a recipe to be able to do that.
How, in 2018, when we're seeing all these platforms that provide recipes, like everyone is going to have a different recipe, for pasta pesto or what have you, how do you incorporate the things that are written on index cards, that are smudged, the things from cookbooks that are passed down? How do you apply technology, and in your case, AI, to pre-existing recipes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of technologies out there that like, for example, on the shoppable recipe side, where you can take an ingredient list and you try to translate that into ultimately SKUs at a grocery store, whether it's Amazon or Kroger or whoever, to then get those, to order that through e-commerce. That's kind of one way. I think that there's companies, I think Chicory is a good example of a company that probably could take your mom's recipe and translate that and turn that into a shoppable recipe. So that's kind of one way. I think there's also just having the ability as a customer, if they've adopted the internet, and maybe you go to sites like Serious Eats for inspiration for recipes. The reality is, all of us who cook have multiple sources for inspiration. No one's going to go to one site. As much as I'd love it if everybody came to Serious Eats and Simply Recipes, they're going to go to a bunch of different sites, and they're going to pull a book off the shelf, and they're going to look at mom's recipe for lasagna. And so you do need to think about, when you're thinking about designing these ecosystems, I think you do have to think about all of those use cases and allow for an individual to personalize that experience based on the types of recipes that they might want to source from and cook.
When you think about culture too, it's a lot of, I guess the millennial generation, for example, is different from previous generations. And I'll give you a quick example. So I think my 18th birthday, my mother promised me to curate a bunch of the recipes and the home-cooked meals that she would make. And 10 years later, I still don't have that cookbook. And so for me, it's understanding, I want to cook this Japanese dish, this traditional Japanese dish, and I'm able to find it online because there are so many different types of blogs out there, influencers, experts out there that can not only help me cook what my parents had made, but maybe even put a little twist on it as well. So I think for culture-wise, I think there's absolutely now is kind of the height of where we are with food, just because there's so much out there.
My mother is also holding recipes hostage as well. So she's like, well, come over and watch me cook it. And I'm like, you sneaky woman. What about you in terms of AI and applying that to, I guess, flavors and tastes that we grew up with?
Yeah, there's always going to be a role for tradition. And when you start looking at the types of flavors that either we as a country or specific regions or other countries and other regions are demanding, those go through large-scale shifts over time. So for example, now in North America, products are more bitter than ever before. We've moved to IPAs, dark chocolate, black coffee, and we've even moved from fruit-flavored parfaits to things like Greek yogurt. And so we see these large-scale demographic shifts based on what people are consuming and what people are exposed to. And so AI can have a role in both modeling that and in helping keep recipes and traditions tasting good today. If you've ever gone to a restaurant that specializes in some older techniques or some ethnic foods, sometimes there's a reason why those recipes are no longer popular. Sometimes it's just because of the effort involved, sometimes it's because the ingredients aren't available, but sometimes it's because it no longer meets consumer preference. And so one of the things that we work on is looking at products that are out on the market, the flavors and flavor profiles that are out on the market, and figuring out if they can be re-optimized and kept competitive with other things that are available.
All right, going to let's talk about Middle America. Where I'm from, if you couldn't tell by my accent. So a lot of the innovation that we're seeing with recipes has to do with making them shoppable, being able to have Amazon deliver groceries or whatever your grocery store of choice is. How do you address that convenience or maybe lack thereof when you're in smaller towns with people who may be as passionate about interacting with the recipes, but maybe just don't live in major metropolitan areas?
So I think, the whole notion of Middle America is also something to question as well. Obviously it's a thing, but in terms of convenience, major retailers out there are pouring money into convenience. Walmart grocery, for example. Not only are they delivering across the country, but they're making it, they have online grocery pickup. So you do engage kind of online in the same way. You do fill your basket, and all you have to do is go to the curb, go to the store, and someone loads up your groceries for you. So I do think that, that's a major focus for many retailers. So I don't think, it's just a East Coast, West Coast kind of play when it comes to convenience and innovation in the retail space. I think it's all across the country.
Yeah, I 100% agree. We like you work with a lot of the grocers, and Kroger, for example, which is one of the largest grocers in the country, is they're hiring hundreds of developers to really focus on the e-commerce kind of opportunity, and then figuring out how to do in-store pickup. One of the things we do is a lot of primary research with our audience, and we've got different audiences. So Serious Eats is very much kind of top 20 urban markets around the country. But Simply Recipes is much more kind of in the heartland, and kind of it's more dispersed around the United States. And both, we see differences and similarities between both audiences. But one of the things that we've noticed is there is almost potentially more interest in in-store pickup than grocery delivery, which is really kind of fascinating, because it is a form of convenience, but it leverages the operational infrastructure of the grocery store, which is everywhere, right? And so with Kroger, with Walmart, with Target, all of them are entirely focused on this opportunity. I think it's more of a matter of time. And even in the last 2 years that we've been kind of engaging on this shoppable recipe journey, we've seen coverage just increase dramatically. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about how you all have seen, you mentioned flavors changing. How have, in your case, the recipes that you write about at your different publications changed? And in your case, how have shoppable recipes changed in maybe, the past 5 years or so?
Yeah. I mean, from a recipe perspective, I think one of our bias at Fexy is that there's lots of different segments to the market, right? As you mentioned, some people like to use mom's recipes or grandma's recipes, and other people want to be on the leading edge, and they're buying, the Food Lab, which is, Kenji Lopez-Alt's book that came out of Serious Eats. And what we've noticed is a couple things. With Serious Eats that's capturing kind of that next generation and a younger cook, they really like to engage with the why and with science. And so we've found they like to know exactly why this is the best recipe. They want to know new techniques. If there's new tools or new ideas that challenge what mom or grandma did, totally fine. So that's kind of changing. And then getting into kind of really precision cooking, I think, has become a big, over the last 10 years of Serious Eats life, that they've really helped drive that precision cooking movement along with others. And I think that's great because it really speaks to what a lot of the people here at the summit are focused on, because now we're getting appliances that are very precise and can actually be driven instructionally by the recipe. If you think the recipe has code, it can really drive those precise temperatures and timings, which is kind of where the audience is going as well. So it is kind of all coming together a little bit, I think.
And from the e-commerce perspective, online grocery perspective, I think recipes aren't necessarily changing to fit e-commerce yet. But I do think that e-commerce in general is changing the grocery and kind of recipe landscape. So, for example, a lot of retailers, when we first started the company back in 2012, there were maybe 2 retailers that were doing online grocery seriously, Peapod and Fresh Direct. And even then, talking with retailers other than those 2, you talk to people and say, hey, do you guys have an API? Do you guys have these types of things? And that was non-existent at the time. And so now, with the need to create infrastructure, the need to kind of create more of this online experience, it has not only helped just e-commerce in general, but it's helped digital. And so retailers and brands and manufacturers now have a digital presence that is far beyond what was around 5 years ago. And so when you think about how do you engage with the consumer, I think that's where a lot of brands are now kind of investing in recipes as well, as a tool to understand and engage with consumers.
The changes that we see that we're tracking are mostly around components and ingredients. Like, for example, 10 years ago, recipes would never call for sriracha, or they wouldn't call for fresh-cut ginger. Whereas now, those types of ingredients and components are available, and you see recipes beginning to incorporate them. And you see a lot of crossover between things like banh mi tacos or bulgogi tacos. And those things are both interesting from a recipe standpoint. They're interesting that you can combine those flavors and you can create something good. But they're also interesting from the availability and the demand standpoint, where individuals are actually interested in acquiring those types of ingredients and those types of flavors, and they're willing to work with them in their own kitchens, not just to go to a restaurant and experience them.
Yeah, and that kind of, it dovetails with one of the things that we wrestle with, and we see it between the 2 big brands that we have, Serious Eats and Simply Recipes, is and it speaks to your question about what about the heartland, in places where they don't have a Whole Foods, or there isn't, like, in Seattle PCC or what have you, some of those harder to find ingredients that I think sometimes, like the more complicated recipes at Serious Eats, for example, aren't available. And so Simply Recipes kind of focuses on making sure that if they are going to use kind of a more unusual ingredient, there's only one of them. And then the other thing that we've had to build into our platform on the shoppable recipe side is substitute ingredients and optional ingredients, so that the recipe developer can say, hey, if this particular thing is not available, you can substitute this. Or, as an option, the recipe will work, but if you really want to enhance it, then get this unusual if you have that available. And so that's a little bit of how we can deal with, availability in different parts of the country for different tastes.
All right, I want to turn to some audience questions because they're coming in like gangbusters. Do recipes actually sell products?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I say that from, obviously my company deals with that a lot. But
I hope they do.
yeah. But there's a whole thing in grocery now. There's this talk about spearfishing versus solutions-based shopping. And spearfishing, let's think about e-commerce for a second. So spearfishing is when you buy one product at a time. So this is how e-commerce used to be done. Think about Amazon, right? When they first started selling books. Books you buy typically one at a time. You can find the book that you want, add it to your cart, and then check out. For groceries, though, you aren't just buying a head of broccoli. You might be adding in other products, other grocery products to that list to make a recipe. Maybe it's dinner that night, or maybe it's your kid's lunch for the next 5 days. But it's always towards a solution, if you will. And so more and more we're seeing recipes. I mean, I think this stat is like 70% of people use recipes to add items to their shopping list. And so recipes are kind of the key to that list, if you will.
We like to say that every shopping list starts with a recipe. It really does. I mean, not every virtually, but we're seeing the same thing. And the interest in being very easily to say, oh, yeah, I'm going to make lasagna, and I'm going to do this Caesar salad recipe, and I'm going to have 10 people over for dinner. Boom, add that to my cart. I don't need butter, I already have that, but I need, and then I move that over to the, to my grocer of choice. That behavior is happening for sure and increasing quickly. Yeah.
And I think somebody who maybe doesn't plan as nearly as much as some other folks do, what percentage of people are shopping straight from a recipe? Doesn't that require a prohibitive amount of planning?
Yeah. On the planning side, the whole reason that we've got into it, that Fexy got into this for our brands, is because we were looking at that daily consumer journey of, what are we having for dinner tonight? And that question is typically asked right around 1 o'clock in the afternoon in America for about 92% of us. Nobody plans. And so so then you think, okay, well then what's the friction? So you're like, all right, what are we having for dinner tonight? All right, maybe I'll make lasagna. Great. And I have an intent, I find a recipe, and it's like, oh my God, it's already 3 o'clock. I have to go to the grocery store. Forget it, I'm just going to order Chinese food. I'm just going to get pizza. And that's one of the reasons that we live such an unhealthy lifestyle here in the United States. And so we were like, okay, that major friction point of acquiring the groceries is something that we really wanted to solve for. So the missing piece was, until about 2 or 3 years ago at scale, is delivery to the home same day in now 1 to 2 hours, or in-store pickup, which also can happen in a 1 to 2 hour time frame, which means now I don't have to plan. And so so it's the opposite almost of that question. It really doesn't require planning. At least that's how we're trying to engineer it. Yeah.
All right, another audience question. What other revenue streams do you see in digital recipes apart from shopping basket referral?
Sure. So for us, we actually have like I mentioned, a whole advertising side of the business. We help brands leverage recipes to reach consumers. So we work with companies like large companies like Mondelez, General Mills, Purdue, et cetera, to help brands again reach consumers kind of in a targeted way. You often see large media companies hold recipe properties because CPG companies know that recipes are powerful. So from our perspective, we reach 80 million monthly unique visitors in the U.S. We're able to, our technology understands recipe content, and we're able to essentially serve very targeted ads to consumers. And so, on top of that, we monetize recipes that way. I think B, for brands, there is a way to monetize recipes from a perspective of owned media content. So recipes that sit on the brand's page, right? I know there are actually a couple companies here, even at this conference, who do kind of syndicated recipe content, but brands often are looking for good content, are looking for, the influencers that say, hey, this is a good way to make lasagna, but, using Campbell's soup or something like that.
I'll jump in from the other side. Because we're upstream of that, working with the CPG companies where products are made, we're frequently surveying the market to look at what's being consumed on premise, what's being consumed off premise, what flavors and aromas are driving and textures are driving preference in non-packaged foods. Because if you can capture those and you can take them, you can bring that back into the brand. And so I think we've seen some things like Tabasco flavored chips or Sriracha flavored chips. Those are pretty interesting, but those became something that could drive preference and could drive consumption decisions because those products began being used in recipes and in the home. And so, yeah, looking at it from the other side, collecting that type of recipe data can be used to build better CPG products and to bring those flavors into packaged goods.
The other, just to add one thing, you had mentioned kind of spear shopping versus kind of more full basket, and recipes kind of bring a whole basket of stuff. I think that, what we see is that, as kind of e-commerce becomes a bigger and bigger thing for food in general, and it's kind of the last major spending category, consumer spending category that's really falling to online commerce. It's different. I've been in the e-commerce space for a long, long time, and it's different, like you said, than buying a book or a television or something specific. It is ultimately a decision on a group of products. And the recipe is really becoming the new shelves. So much like the CPG companies spend money for exact shelf placement, end aisle displays, couponing at the register. Similarly now, what we're both dealing with is the recipe is becoming the shelves. That product can be slotted in and then carried through to that whole experience. So it opens up a whole world of different monetization opportunities. Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one last question that 5 people have given a thumbs up that they want answered. Many people's family recipes are unmeasured or unwritten. And those recipes my mother has held hostage are an example of that. How do you see this improvisational or cultural cooking with younger people today?
I'll take a first crack, and then you see what you guys think.
Yeah.
I think that everybody goes through different life stages, and we like to talk about the millennials and how different they are, and all the difference between them and past generations. And while
how we ruin every
you
industry.
guys ruin everything,
Diamonds,
totally. Yeah, everything.
Divorces.
Right.
We're ruining.
Well, and some of those differences are true, but I also think that it's a little bit of life stage things. I think that, once we have kids and once those kids start getting a little older, we start remembering, once those kids get to the age where we remember being that age, and we think fondly about maybe what mom cooked or what my grandmother cooked, then I think you start to get more interested in your culture and your family's history, and maybe bringing in some of those recipes and thinking about food that came, from when you were growing up. And so I don't think that if the nature of the question is, do we think that cultural cooking of recipes that have been passed down for generations are going to go away? I don't think so. I really don't. But that's.
I would, yeah, I totally agree. And as a personal example of that, you can look at the family recipes and you can look at the way that these recipes are changing based on availability and based on what people are expecting from them. So my family cooks a Jewish-style beef brisket, big brisket, browned on one side, stewed with potatoes and vegetables and beer. And when my mom used to cook that recipe, she would always use Heineken Dark. Well, of course, now having gone through the American craft beer boom and being a beer drinker, I would never use Heineken Dark. So I use an American craft beer instead. And it's interesting because I'm looking for that same type of flavor, the flavor that I grew up with, that I had at home, but I've changed it to something that I think is better. I've replaced the ingredients with something that I believe is superior.
And I think, just to add my 2 cents here, I think for every generation, when you are in your 20s, your 30s, and you're working, and, that's maybe you don't have kids yet or something like that, life ends up being extremely busy. And I think for millennials, especially with social media, you're being, overwhelmed with what your friends are doing, all this kind of stuff, and you feel constantly behind. I think if you look at meal kits and just the adoption rate, I think the $20 off or something helped. But it's also cry for help to a certain extent. It's saying, hey, I want to cook. I want to eat healthier. I want to do these things. This seems like a great way to do it. And so, for me, anecdotally, my parents, my family's cooking, I ended up adopting a lot of the stuff that's easiest to make. You know, I can get home from work. You know, I get home at 8:30, and I can just make something in 20 minutes. Those are the kinds of cultural meals that I've ended up adopting. Yeah.
All right, well, gentlemen, we are out of time, so thank you so much, and thank you guys for your questions.
Thank you very much.